Cristoforo Columbus. We're going to talk about him and his accomplishments today in his life. Controversial character in history, like many. But Cristoforo Columbus, we have a day off, federal day off in his memory. Some people argue that maybe we shouldn't, and he maybe was a horrible person, and some people argue he was a great explorer, and a lot of the possible atrocities that he did were not his fault. And I'm going to leave it up to you to decide. So we're going to research Columbus today and see if we can debunk any myths of his life. Okay, in 1451, Cristoforo Colombo, later known as Cristoforo Columbus, was born in the Italian port city. So here is Cristoforo Columbus being born in Italy. So he is Italian. Okay, by the age of 14, Columbus was already working as a sailor on a local merchant's ships. 1484, Columbus asks the King John of Portugal for money and ships necessary for a trip to try to sail to Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, which is known at times as the Sea of Darkness. So in theory, he would say, well, we could travel west to get to the east instead of having to travel around Africa. Okay, after King of Portugal refused his request, Columbus left Portugal for Spain in 1485, where he asked King Ferdinand and his Queen Isabella to finance his voyage. So the king and queen gave him money to go ahead. Here's why. Okay, preoccupied with their war against the Muslim Moors, the Spanish monarchy refused Columbus' request at first. So what happened was Spain, for many centuries, was controlled by Islamic empires, having influence there. Now Europe is going through the Renaissance, and they're regaining land from previously owned by Muslim empires called the Moors. So, however, after defeating the Moors in 1492, Isabella and King Ferdinand decided to finance Columbus's voyage. So here we are. Here is Spain, and Spain is taken back by European powers, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Now they have all kinds of money, and they really want to show off. Most nations would not support Columbus's crazy idea of sailing west to get to Asia, but this was kind of like a bet on their part, kind of throwing him $100 down to say, well, we'll see how you do or not. No one expected him to actually succeed. But Columbus was given a crew of 90 men and their 3 ships. Hopefully you remember the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Okay, during the voyage, the crew was tempted to mutiny and return home from Spain, but only Columbus knew the route back to Europe. So he kind of underestimated the distance it would be. He thought that maybe we would get to Europe, he would get to Europe, or from Europe to Asia very quickly. But the Atlantic Ocean is a large ocean, and they continue to sail west, and sail further west, and sail further west, taking weeks and weeks and weeks. And people on the crew are wondering, we're in the middle of the ocean, we need to turn back, or else maybe we could fall off the face of the earth, or maybe we'll never find Asia, and we're going to just continue to just keep going and going and going. But Columbus kept them at bay, because if you're on a boat and you have nowhere to go, you have to follow that leader. He's the only one that knows it back to Europe. So here is his crew.
Columbus coming to the New World, he's got dollar signs for pupils. His motivation is almost purely financial. There's fortunes to be made in finding new trade routes to the Spice Islands.
Cristoforo Columbus tries to figure out a new way to get to the east in order to find his access to pepper. He travels west and you will end up, whether you knew it or not, discovering the New World.
There's vast amounts of confusion and murkiness where the actual idea of going west comes from. Part of it we know is that he convinced himself that the world is much smaller than it actually is, and that the Atlantic was little. And so instead of going all the way around Africa and to India, and then beyond that to get spices and porcelain and silk and jewels and all the things of the East that they wanted, you could just take this little jump. So he came in contact with this fellow called Toscanelli. Toscanelli had a map that purported to show the entire world. And on this map, you could, with a little bit of squinting and imagination, clearly see how you could go from Portugal or Spain all the way over to China. In Columbus's mind, it confirmed him in the rightness of his ideas. We now know that the distance he wanted to travel was 16,000 miles, but he convinced himself it was just a couple thousand miles.
And he thought he was going to reach China in 4 days. And all the scholars of the day knew he was off in his calculations of the circumference of the Earth.
Nonetheless, he managed eventually to talk one of the monarchies of Europe into funding this completely ludicrous venture, which paid off. Columbus arrives somewhere in the Bahamas. He has already this idea that there are these islands outside of China, and that there's lots of them. Marco Polo knows about Japan, and that Japan has lots of islands. So his initial thought is, I must be somewhere, in the suburbs of Japan. Columbus, being who he is, says, these people are wearing these gold earrings and, necklaces and signs of wealth. They must be in contact with some wealthier society, because otherwise why would they have gold?
And every time he ran into some new spice or some new food, he said, oh yes, this is just the outskirts of Asia, and look what we found now.
And in fact, he goes back 3 more times. Each time, the idea is just a little bit further, and I'll find Asia, and prove I was really right, and that it wasn't an accident that I found this new land. And to his dying day, he insisted that he had found Asia.
Okay, so 1492, Columbus is sailing. I don't want to do that. Okay, moving on here. So he does take 4 voyages. Columbus landed in what is now the modern-day Bahamas. Okay, he also later landed in Cuba, the island of Hispaniola, where he surveyed the land for gold, set up a small settlement, and returned to Spain. So these were his major voyages. As you can see, he never touched the mainland of the continental North America. Okay, but Columbus is after riches and gold.
The Second Fleet left in September 1493 with huge expectations. Columbus was anxious to return to Hispaniola to see whether the little colony he'd left behind had resulted in a windfall of gold and spices. But what he found was that the colony had become a killing field.
There was increasing friction over the Spaniards wanting food, over their treatment of the women, over their demands for gold, and finally they were all killed, probably massacred by the infuriated indigenous people. And that unfortunately sets the tone for all the later interaction between the Spaniards and the indigenous inhabitants of the West Indies.
From this point on, the Indians became little more than slaves. Every Indian over 14 years old was forced to mine for gold.
They're taken from their total freedom, and they're forced to get gold, which is a meaningless substance for them, out of the ground to give to these people, and they're forced and they're beaten and they're exploited. The Indians simply, when they were caught up in this, they lost the will to live. They could not picture the world that the Spanish imagined.
But it's a world Columbus had imagined from the start.
The first day he encounters the Indians, he talks about what beautiful bills they are and what good slaves they're going to make. He takes Indians who come to him to trade and he captures them and he keeps them.
Columbus was a man of his times. Columbus, like the settlers, was there to make money. He was not too particular about the ways that he chose to make money, because that's the way people behaved. There was a flourishing slave trade in Europe in the Middle Ages. Slavery was a customary part of European society. It didn't seem in any way unnatural for Columbus or the other settlers to do this.
One of the chiefs has a vision when he takes this drug cohobe, in which he sees that a clothed people will come and destroy the Indians, and that after he dies, his people won't live long, that they will die in starvation and in slavery.
Okay, so the people who are here, the Native Americans, were being exploited for slavery. Okay, but like they said, slavery had been around for thousands of years, and back then people thought that it was just a part of life, and it really kind of was. On his third voyage, Columbus was so desperate for sailors that he was forced to use prisoners. Unable to control his rowdy crowd, Columbus made an example of some of them by hanging. Okay, enraged that the Italian sailor would hang Spanish citizens, the Spanish official ordered Columbus to be placed in chains and sent back to Spain in 1500. By 1504, Columbus would complete 4 voyages to the New World, where an exchange of goods and, unfortunately, diseases became known as the Columbian Exchange. So we're going to take a look at the Columbian Exchange. Goods that have never been seen before in Europe are brought from the New World to Europe, and things are brought to the New World from Europe. Okay, so we take a look at the New World. That means the Americas, North and South America. Corn, potatoes, beans, cocoa, that is chocolate, or the plant to make chocolate. Pumpkins, tomatoes, the turkey. This big one, tobacco, gold, silver, and also disease such as syphilis are brought over to Europe. Now, the European diet is going to change dramatically as a result of this. There wasn't any pizza or anything in Italy until the tomato was brought over. The Irish survive off of potatoes. That's all brought over with the Columbian Exchange. Now in the exchange here, in the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, you have wheat, sugar, cane, rice, coffee, olives, and citrus fruit. Tobacco is traded, gold is traded, silver, the horse is brought over, cows, pigs, and then smallpox, measles, influenza, typhoid. These diseases now are going to wipe out most of the native populations, and we'll talk about that here. So this is going to be Columbus's last voyage to the New World.
The 4th voyage is Columbus's fastest crossing. Driven westwards by the trade winds, it takes just 21 days for the fleet of the master mariner to traverse the Atlantic. But after traveling so far, so fast, it suddenly seems that all that awaits them is disaster. Columbus, always alert to the elements, notices a strange change in the weather. He observes a calm in the air, abnormal currents, and unusual cloud formations. It's a sign of a deadly Caribbean threat. To Columbus, it can mean only one thing: a hurricane. Columbus knows that his fleet will never survive the coming storm. So he wastes no time sending a messenger to Ovando, his replacement as governor, warning him of the impending storm and begging for permission to land on Hispaniola. But Columbus knows he's going against the orders of the Spanish monarchs. They have only agreed to back the 4th voyage on the condition that he never sets foot in his own colony, Hispaniola, again.
By the time Columbus arrived at Hispaniola, his name was mud among the Spanish colonists. Nobody liked him. Everybody remembered his cruel and tyrannical rule as governor of the colony.
But Columbus has no choice. He desperately needs a safe harbor as refuge from the approaching storm. His messenger returns with the terrible news that Governor Ovando won't allow them to land on Hispaniola. Nobody on land believes a storm is coming. For Columbus, it is a devastating blow. He will now have to rely purely on his skill as a sailor to survive. Realizing that the hurricane is veering north of Hispaniola, he navigates his ships in the opposite direction. He anchors them in a sheltered bay, which he hopes will give some protection from the full force of the hurricane. As night falls, the hurricane strikes. The raw power of the ocean overwhelms them, tearing each vessel from its anchorage and scattering them out to sea. Columbus later recorded the terror of that night.
The storm was terrible, and on that night my ship was broken up. Everyone lost hope, and was quite certain that all the rest were drowned.
So Columbus's fourth voyage does not go very well, and he does go down in history at that time as being a failure. Later on in history, we do re-examine Columbus's life and have a more unbiased view of him. Columbus dies in 1506 at the age of 55, and his body is entombed in the Cathedral of Seville in Spain. But at that time, he had been, even after death, he had moved several times to his final resting place. So this is the tomb of Cristoforo Columbus in Spain. Okay, now that Columbus has brought Europeans and the Columbian Exchange over, Europeans are continuing to flood into the New World from all over.